Hello, everyone. My name is Kelsey Mullen, and I'm the Director of Education for the Providence Preservation Society. It's my pleasure to welcome you here this afternoon. Before we get underway, we want to acknowledge that the Providence Preservation Society is situated on the ancestral and unceded lands of the Narragansett Nation. This acknowledgement reminds us of the significance of place, the continued existence of Indigenous peoples, and PPS's commitment to building respectful relationships with those who call these lands home today. This year's symposium has explored housing in all its complexity. For most people, this is an incredibly personal and also political topic, and together we've considered both dimensions and how preservation can play a role in addressing the housing crisis here in Providence and beyond. Today marks the last of our symposium programs, and we so appreciate all of you who've joined us throughout for some of our many programs over the last 2 weeks. And if you're just joining today for the closing program, do know that we will be sharing recordings of all of our symposium programs on our YouTube channel by mid-December. So you'll be able to access that and catch up on some of the really wonderful and challenging conversations we've had over the last 10 days. This session too is being recorded and will be added to that library. And we want you to participate as much as you feel comfortable doing. So please share your comments and thoughts in the chat. And as you have questions for our panelists today, we encourage you to put those in the Q&A function so we can keep track of them and get to as many as we can at the end. We're very grateful to our presenting sponsor this year, Cornish Associates, who has made this program possible, as well as our session sponsor for today, Schoberth. This is, of course, in addition to our many partners in preservation who support us year-round. Today's program is really, in some ways, the most rooted in preservation of anything that we've offered over the course of the symposium. One of the things that is so challenging and exciting as preservationists is that we have this ever receding horizon, this vanishing horizon of what is considered historic, worthwhile, worthy of preservation and attention and funding. And it hasn't always included vernacular styles or ordinary architecture, especially when we have many, many examples of a particular style. But today, our panel will explore some of the more recent styles, and by recent, I mean in the last 100-odd years of history here in Rhode Island and greater New England, and reckon with some of those questions about, how much of this building stock we have left, how much is being intentionally preserved, whether it might serve any new purpose, and how we really cultivate and preserve the stories that go along with the sites of workforce housing. Today's conversation will be guided by our colleague, Leigh Schoberth, who is the Senior Preservation Services Manager at Historic New England, which gives her a tremendous sort of global perspective here over the New England region. And she will be leading us through today's discussion. So with that, I'd like to welcome Leigh and our panelists today.
Thank you, Kelsey. I'd also like to say thank you to everybody who is joining us for this section. I think we're going to have some really great information, some really great discussion going with this. And so I'd also like to say thank you to the Providence Preservation Society for the opportunity to be a part of this wonderful symposium, kind of exploring a lot of different facets of housing, affordable housing. And today we're kind of looking at our workforce housing and preservation. So I'm going to kind of briefly introduce our three speakers, and then I will turn it over to them to kind of give their presentations, and then we'll have some really great discussion at the end, and of course welcoming questions from the audience. So our first speaker is Rachel Robinson. She joined Providence Preservation Society as the Director of Preservation in August of 2017. She is the former Executive Director of Vieux Carré Commission Foundation and Felicity Brave Development Incorporation. Both of those were in New Orleans. Rachel holds a master's degree in urban and environmental planning and a certificate in historic preservation from the University of Virginia, and a master's degree in historical and sustainable architecture from NYU London. And of course, I could go on and on about the accomplishments of all of our speakers, but I'll keep these brief and encourage you to kind of read their full bios online. But I've had the pleasure to work with Rachel on a couple of different projects and glad to have her here today. So Marc Levitt, our second speaker, is a filmmaker, educator, author, internationally performing storyteller, and public forum creator, host, audio artist, and keynote speaker. So Marc is currently working on the production of a film, ThreeDeckers, A New England Love Story, and is working with the New England School District as a scholar in residence. Levitt is also a community activist, advocating for policies that preserve and enhance place and that support equity, diversity, and child-centered education. And our final speaker is Ned Connors. He was born and raised in Rumford, Rhode Island. He holds a master's degree from Brown University in American Studies. And Connors began working in preservation as a consultant in 1991. His company, Ed Connors and Associates, has specialized in the preparation of National Registers of Historic Place nominations, and we'll hear about one of those today. And they've also worked on a wide variety of properties with a particular interest in historical, industrial, and engineering sites. And just this year, he was the recipient of the Frederick C. Williamson Professional Leadership Award at the annual Rhodey Awards, sponsored by Preserve Rhode Island and the State Preservation Commission. So I'm going to now hand over the mic to Rachel Robinson, our first speaker. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Leigh. And a big thanks to my colleague and counterpart, Kelsey Mullen, for putting together such a wonderful and important symposium. Let me share screen and we'll get started. So we have focused this symposium on housing, many facets of housing. And as Kelsey said, this is the more architectural history and preservation session. So we're going to introduce to you all some housing types that are still quite prevalent in our landscape. I have the perception that there's a misperception that preservationists are only interested in saving the biggest and prettiest and most expensive and most finely detailed buildings out there, primarily houses, and that's simply not true. Historic preservationists and architectural historians love buildings. We love architecture of all stripes and all sizes and scales. And I'm really pleased that today's panel provides me the opportunity to look at more modest and vernacular housing here in Providence, a lot of which is hiding in plain sight. So I want to help you train your eye and my eye to looking at some housing that we pass almost every day and might not realize how special and old it is. So I'm going to focus on Mill Village housing, and yes, we can find villages within the city of Providence. But first, let's start with a quick recap. If it's been a while since you were in 4th grade American history, the American Industrial Revolution began in Pawtucket at the end of the 18th century. Samuel Slater brought over memorized proprietary information about how to harness water power for the production of textiles, and thus began the American Industrial Revolution. But importantly, he also brought with him knowledge of how to recruit people from farms, from rural areas to a mill, to work in the mills, and how to control them. And so a lot of the things I will underscore have to do with the people who worked in these mills, but the importance of the buildings around them, including the houses. So here is an unidentified mill, though I'm sure this scene is familiar to many of you, all of you. We've seen buildings, either one in isolation that survives or a group of buildings like this. You will always find a mill building located next to water. We've got to have the water source for the power, or else there's no industrial revolution. So this scene we're pretty familiar with, but what we might not realize is the cluster of houses in some of our smaller villages and neighborhoods are really part of this ecosystem of the mill village. It doesn't always have to be isolated in a rural area like this one. This is actually taken from Hope Village up in Scituate, which is a district. The entire district is on the National Register of Historic Places, which is wonderful because it gives us documentation of not just the mill buildings, but the building, an inventory of the buildings around the mill. So I hope that after this presentation, you can begin to see some of this worker housing that's hiding, if it survives, it's hiding in plain sight. So let's start with an unassuming site in Providence, in Olneyville, though I am sure you are aware of this. If you see in the upper left, the Atlantic Mill, probably our most identifiable and rock star mill building, because it has the two iconic domed towers. But if we look at a landscape like this, where the green area is in the middle, you might not automatically know that that was also the site of a mill. But if we begin to look for some of these clues, proximity to water, where the arrow is pointing, check, we've got that. Proximity to another mill, check, that can also be part of it. And then housing across the street. If we look at these modest houses, we can begin to realize that this was probably the site of a mill. And in fact, it was. We have photographic evidence. So this complex was in that nook of the water next to Atlantic Mill. These buildings do not survive, but because we are learning how to read the landscape and hopefully pick up some clues about how to do some documentary research, we can put the picture together. So let's look at a historical map. If this type of map is not immediately familiar to you, allow me to introduce the Sanborn fire insurance maps. They were produced between the mid-19th to the mid-20th century. They are the gift that keeps on giving to historians and urban planners, because it allows us to track the development of cities and towns across the United States. And they were made for one purpose, but like I said, they're the gift that keeps on giving. So here we see one thing that's really important that I want to point out, first of all, is that we see pink and yellow. Pink in Sanborn vernacular nomenclature refers to a masonry structure, and yellow for wood. And so we can see Atlantic Mill to the middle left there, and our missing mill, our lost mill. These places were huge, and they were masonry structures, often brick, sometimes stone. And they were just really, really big and just organic. They kept growing and growing as the technology and production increased. But I want you to focus on where the people who worked in the mills lived. And we can see this in the landscape. Very regularly spaced and built cottages means it, where I've circled it, should say, this was not done by neighbors who just automatically built just like their neighbors. These were done intentionally, either by speculation or built by the mill company itself. Do these still survive? They do. So you've probably, like me, passed these a million times and not noticed. And so now we can begin to appreciate the age, the historical significance, and the contribution to housing people for decades and decades that we find in these double cottages. This is another example farther up Manton Avenue. These are identified as tenements, but they are larger double houses or flats. And these are related to the Dyerville Mill. So again, I've passed these so many times and not really realized how important they are in terms of American industrial heritage and the housing of people for nearly 160 years, and presumably still serving that function today. All right, we're going to go to another mill in Olneyville. This is the Earnscliffe or Paragon Mill. PPS has brought this to the public's attention many times, including through our most endangered properties list. So this might be familiar to you. We'll look at it in the map, and now we have a better sense of how to read it on a map, I've put two plates together so we can see this little microcosm village within the dense urban fabric of Olneyville and Providence. So here we are right off Manton Avenue, and the mill, a smaller version because it grew, is circled. The water is identified by the arrow. You've got to be next to water. And then in yellow, we can find some wooden structures that would have been houses. A lot of these in this particular neighborhood do not survive, but some do. And here are two examples. So the name of the street has changed. That often happens, or it can happen. But the houses, these two houses remain, and they might have changes like siding and windows replaced, but they do survive. And if we realize again the close proximity to the water and to the mill, we can assume that these are workers' cottages. I want to point out that I think it's interesting what caught my eye in this lower section. I'm not sure if you can see my arrow, but below Albert Court, we see some other court configurations of cottages that don't even have streets. And so again, I think that underscores the pedestrian nature of working, living close to where you work and having everything else, the other needs within walking distance because you didn't own a car. But I just think it's curious. A few of these houses survive, but they do have streets now because the fire department does want to be able to reach your house. And we also have other services as the mill village develops. So here is an example of a police station. This photograph is taken from PPS's online guide to Providence architecture. And for children who were fortunate enough not to be put to work in the mill, we had to provide services for them. This school and children's home do not survive. But in the lower right, you will notice that across the water and across the street, we have services in Olneyville Square. So you could get your hair cut, you could go to a restaurant, all in the very little free time that you had. But you'll also find the church, the library. And again, this pattern is just replicated over and over again, whether or not you're in a city like Providence or in a more rural area. Okay, excuse me. So here we're gonna, our final pit stop is up in the tip top corner, northern corner of Providence. And this is the Swansea Company. And our first arrow, we gotta have water, check. These mill buildings survive and are being adaptively reused. And then the street behind us, from this aerial, we can't really tell that there's an elevation and a grade change, but there is. And although there were company houses built on this street for the working class, this is more managerial and administrative homes for single family residences. The upper corner arrow rather points to a house that I hesitated to show you because I do want to focus on the more modest types of worker housing. But this is in fact the superintendent's home. And I did decide to share it with you because our first cohort of workforce and window training students were able to work on the windows of this building, which survives for their final project a year ago. So it's a beautifully detailed house, has lots of great woodwork and tiles, and now some restored windows thanks to our students. Up the street from the superintendent's house was the all-important church. In any mill village, you are going to find a church. And depending on whether your workforce as immigrants from French Canada or Ireland came in as Catholics, or from England or Scotland or elsewhere in New England, they were Protestant, you can have one of those churches or both. Again, cycle of immigration. And this church survives today. Okay. So those are some of the peripheral set pieces that we always find, but we're going to cross Branch Avenue, and below the water and below the mill, which would be just right off the upper right corner there, we have some A+ regularity here. This is military precision development of housing across the street from the mill. So now you know that yellow means wood buildings and pink means masonry. And we're going to see, do you think any of these buildings survive? They do, quite a few of them in this neighborhood. So in the top left, we have some more double cottages built out of wood. And that row survives. And then this isolated building, I have blown up the illustration from the map here so that you can see what it says. F in Sanborn language means flats, flat, so an apartment. We can see the numbers. I think it's peculiar that there are 3 numbers, even though we seem to have 2 main units or blocks of buildings, but the 3 indicates 3 stories. So there are 3 main stories to this building. Now, if we were doing deep research and documentation, we would want to, verify that these are the same buildings. But it all looks good so far that these are the original buildings. This Sanborn map dates to 1920, I believe. And so we can begin to match up what we see on the ground today that survives, thinking about the close proximity to the mill and finding evidence on the map and understanding what we're looking at. Here are the masonry structures that survive. All 4 of these rows survive. So we've got 2 rows of double brick cottages that are finely detailed with some brick and have a nice Gothic revival cross gable peak there above the front doors and attic windows. So those survive. And then 2 long rows of more densely packed row houses, essentially, that survive on Shiloh and Long Block. And so again, I would hope my eye would look at these cottages on Winchester and think, oh, those are nicely detailed and mostly brick. I imagine that to be a Victorian building. I don't know that I would have given a second glance to the row houses down here. They're not finely detailed. The windows have been changed, the doors have been changed. But again, I think if we can just train our eye to look at the quality of the brick, the arrangement of the buildings, the scale and proportion of understanding the difference between how we built in the 19th century versus the 20th and 21st, I think we can begin to appreciate the age and particularly the location of these buildings. To the left of these buildings, to the west right there, is a school, but it does not survive. All right, so that's my quick whistle-stop tour of 3 mill villages within the city of Providence. During this research, I uncovered a source that I did not know about. I use the Providence Public Library's online digital photos all the time, almost daily, but I didn't know there was a whole collection of images of Rhode Island villages and mills. This is incredible. I encourage you to get a cup of hot chocolate and take a look at all 11 pages of images. And it's not just the majestic and large mill building as we see in the center, but they also have aerials and streetscapes of mill villages all across Rhode Island, and then also individual structures, the cottages, the workforce housing, details of doors. It's just an incredible, incredible resource. And these are 2 other resources I use all the time. Anything mill related, I grab our book, Run of the Mill, that we have in the PPS library, which is a great pictorial book from the 1970s that not only talks about the history and development of the Industrial Revolution in New England, but also the people. This was the era of social history coming online so that we could really focus on the people who worked long and difficult hours in these structures. And then, as I said, some of these mills are individually listed, or the entire village is listed on the National Register of Historic Places. And so our State Historic Preservation Office has a great website where you can search properties that are in Rhode Island and read those nominations that have great information. But I do want to close with people, because we wouldn't have any of these people, we wouldn't have any of these textiles if it weren't for the people who worked in them. And you might be surprised that the very first employees up in Pawtucket were children, and followed by women, because cheap and available labor. So these children are from the Swansea Company, which for some reason keeps coming up this week. And finally, I want to share this event that PPS hosted a couple years ago at Earnscliffe Woolen Mill in Olneyville. We had a Sights and Stories series where we paired academics and artists to look and reinterpret some of our most endangered properties. And this was the most fantastic choral production. We're going to share the link and you can watch this video online. But it was amazing and really important for us to populate the mill building itself with the people, the women who worked here. Just think about how dangerous it was and how noisy it was. But now we can also think about where they lived, probably just across the street, across Delane Street in Olneyville. So that is my quick tour of Mill Village housing. Thank you so much. And now I believe I'm handing it off to Marc, who will talk about another beloved and ubiquitous form of vernacular housing in Rhode Island, and that is our TripleDeckers.
Thank you, Rachel. I live in a factory building, so kind of we aren't on the water, but I'm definitely curious to go out and kind of look for some of those signs because I know some of the houses around here, I've seen some of those details that you're pointing out. So you've got me, I'm interested to kind of go do a little more of my own mill research. So I will, next we're going to be hearing from Marc Levitt with ThreeDeckers. But to start, Marc has a clip from his documentary that he'd like to share. So I'm just going to bring that up here for everyone. And we'll get started with that.
Like 6 3-deckers in a row. The interior of the 3-decker has a Janus-like quality to it. I think the architects or the builders intended the rooms to have formal Victorian functions. The front room, the parlor, the middle room, perhaps a dining room. The rear rooms were the bedrooms. But in fact, with large immigrant families, this was not often the case. The dining room became a bedroom, or the living room, the parlor became the dining room, or the bedrooms were doubled up into multiple residence bedrooms.
I would always visit my grandmother, who was on the 3rd floor, so it was simple walking up one flight of stairs from where we lived, and we'd do errands for her if she needed something to the grocery store and stuff like that. So it was like living together but living separately.
My grandparents lived in a 3-decker, as did my mother, and it's always been a source of fascination, which is amplified by the fact that I went to school in Worcester College at Clark, a city full of 3-deckers.
To be frank with you, I never thought of coming to the United States. Unknown to me, this friend of mine, who is now a professor, filled in this form of, what they call it, lottery, National Visa Lottery. And then I think about several months later, I got a package. Congratulations, big one like this, congratulations. You and your family qualify to come over to the United States of America.
I began to sort of specialize in 3-decker research. It became, at least for Eastern Massachusetts, if not for much of New England, the go-to multiple family housing stock for the immigrant housing.
Prince, my wife, and the entire family of the O'Brien came over to the United States.
I believe TripleDeckers have a political function, if you will, in the sense that when, in the research on the Bread and Roses strike in Lawrence in 1912, and the research on the strike that followed you can see when you look at something as fascinating as the arrest records, people coming out of blocks and engaging in strike activity, you definitely have a sense of ownership of the place. You don't have the atomization that ultimately suburban life, Levitt towns, and other things create. The TripleDeckers and the community that they foster lend themselves to people being together in more public spaces and in more public ways.
The strike in Lawrence in 1912, known as the Bread and Roses strike, was a real explosion in American history. But in Lawrence, what became interesting was that because of the dense population, because of the TripleDeckers, you had all sorts of different ethnicities living together. It was immigrants and so-called unskilled workers who went to strike, not the usual AFL craft unions. So until that moment, most strikes and most labor organizing and labor unions had been generated and propelled by skilled laborers, and by the whole idea that there was a difference between skilled, the aristocracy of labor, and the less skilled immigrant workers and just the sort of proletariat that was not of use to labor unions, which included women. Because women shared these female responsibilities, the traditional responsibilities of food preparation and laundry and childcare, why didn't they talk to each other? They had to talk to each other. And what that meant for me and for the strike was a new way of thinking about how solidarity came about. Not through the unions or even through the IWW, the Industrial Workers of the World. Solidarity really began to come about at the local grocery stores where women operated. It came about through the sharing of these traditional responsibilities through women and comparing wage packets. But when women were coming home, there was Italians and Syrians and Lithuanians all kind of comparing at the local grocery store and then bringing that conversations into the tenements. And that was reinforced when I began to look at who was arrested during the strike. And I began to then find out through the manuscript census schedules where these women lived. So I had 85 women arrested during the strike, and they all lived in communities pretty much near each other, but about 20 of them lived on top of each other. They all lived in the same tenements.
With the front porch, and you sat on the front porch and you just watched the cars go by. Whoever's go, oh, hi, Miss So-and-so, and you start talking. And so you commune that way. And sitting on the front porch, also, you'd have your dessert, maybe after dinner, sitting out on the front porch, having your dessert. And you talk with each other and have friends, and you'd be speaking to people that are driving by. And so it was all communal.
I met with the elders.
Great. So Marc, I think we'll hand it over to you now. I think that was the clip you wanted to share with everyone.
Yeah, I think I was going to show that last one, but I don't know. Don't worry about it. It's fine about it. Yeah, thank you very much. And thank you everybody out there. Should I start or what should we go? Good. Thank you everybody, and thank you PPS. PPS has really been involved with me in a number of projects, and I have nothing but praise for them. And my aspiration is one day, hopefully, I'll be on their most endangered list. So it's wonderful to be part of this and part of you out there, even though this is the most weird thing ever, I think, to talk on these kind of Zoom ways. But I guess we use what we can. That what you just saw was not actually what the film is going to be like at all. It's basically like a very, very, very rough draft. I still have about half to go on the piece, but I've had luck to get great footage, great people so far to interview. But as you know, especially during a pandemic, doing a film is a precarious production. But we'll finish it. It's just a question of when. And I have another one that I'm working on now, but I'm not going to talk about that because it has nothing to do with housing. But as I was listening to the wonderful talk before, and thinking about what I did on this piece, I realized how how significant these types of houses were and still are in the worlds that we're surrounded by. When I was doing this piece, I really didn't think anything about you know, what's on the historical register, what's not on the historical register. And yet now, as I realize it, I don't know if there are any triple deckers on the historical register. And to me, it's clear from the work that I did that and work that I've seen others, that triple deckers literally changed the world. They changed the world that we live in. I mean, so many quotes in there. One of the great things is you realize that the triple deckers housed multicultural environments. They changed the world by bringing together various people from different backgrounds. What happens when that happens, of course, is that everybody is changed by virtue of their relationship to one another. People who haven't met each other, don't know languages, have no history with anybody like that they've ever met, are, for better and worse, ultimately changed by their interaction. And it's one of the things that I wanted to bring out about triple deckers and have us recognize the way in which industrial America changed the entirety of how people lived, who they lived with, and the way in which we carried ourselves, walked, the music we listened to, et cetera, et cetera. What I loved about triple deckers when I got into it was the fact that we bleed into each other. The way in which we interrelate to one another changed entirely, because suddenly we were in a world where it wasn't, the people around us were not predictable in their religions, in their foods. One of the pieces that I think we didn't get out of this, and I don't know what happened with it, was some discussion that was held in Lewiston, Maine. For those of you who know Lewiston, Maine, realize that it was and still is, a big industrial city, and a lot were originally the French Canadian and the Irish. And one of the things that I heard about when I got up there to do research on a particular battle that was had in Lewiston was the fights that occurred between the Irish and the French Canadian. In other words, the people who had come from different parts of Africa moved up to Rhode Island, moved up to Lewiston. They themselves got into huge battles with one another. And I have a whole section of film about how they related to one another. And it's so mixed and so interesting in that some people really learned different things from each other, but others were scared. Some people didn't like the smells coming down, up and down the stairways. There was every contestation, every strangeness that you can imagine manifested. Of course, it happened with the French Canadians and the Irish as well. Somebody told me stories about the Irish pushing the French Canadians into the water, I forgot the name of that river. But these kinds of difficult relationships also gave birth to relationships between one another. And I think it's very interesting for us to understand triple deckers as a way in which America itself is created and was created now. One of the things that I did, and why I got into triple deckers was kind of strange. It was maybe 1977, 78, 79. And a man who worked at the Providence Recreation Department, or whatever it was called then, he asked me if I wanted to put together a performance of some kind for a festival they were doing. And so I had been intrigued slightly just in the beginnings of my knowledge, because I moved up here from, at the time, I think I was in San Francisco before here. I was fascinated by triple deckers because growing up in New York City, I was very interested in multiculturalism. So what I did was create a fictional, theatrical, fictional triple decker from about inhabited by about 7 or 8 people from 7 or 8 different countries. And I created a piece that followed those people getting to know one another, watching their music changed by virtue of how they related to one another and how they got along first very tentatively and then later as a community. And in some ways, the triple decker, more than anything else to me that I've ever run across, is a metaphor for the best of America. And by that, I mean simply the richness and the fullness of life here in this country when it's at its best. Because, and everybody says this, the more you interview people, it was great for me to live in the triple decker because I became someone who understood and was respectful, but also learned from the various ethnic groups that came. If that's not a reason to put a triple decker into the National Register, I don't know what is, because it was a way in which people moved together, learned about each other, and became something different. Now you see a lot of these triple deckers, of course. I mean, I can go on and on about it, which I won't right now. But what you see, unfortunately, now, of course, is a lot of triple deckers being torn down. If you go even as simply up north to our city up north in Rhode Island, you notice that every triple decker practically that shows any degree of decay is getting torn down. The mayor up there, I guess, has a different view of economic development, one of which is, like many did, especially the ones up in Massachusetts, they took down a lot of the triple deckers, not realizing that it is a rich repository of history, for one, but also an opportunity for creating an economic world based on the coming together of those various groups. It's Lewiston, oh, go ahead, sorry. Yes, hello? Oh, okay. How much time do we have so I can know how much time do we have? Oh, you can't hear. I can't hear. And we'll talk more when we get some questions and answers. It really is the creation of the American industrial workers. The triple decker and the American industrial workers, as you saw in that first strike there, is what the content of a nature of these triple deckers and what they were able to do. The way in which people, I'm looking at some of my notes, the way in which people moved around eventually and moved from place to place, which is what they did do, is another asset. And what they did is take what they learned in one place and moved it to another. One of the things I find interesting is how a sense of place is created. And the triple decker really created a sense of place. It created a little mini community. What it did was make an environment that was filled with opportunity of getting to know one another, because there was always situations where someone needed help. There was always situations where one family had someone sick, perhaps someone else had to go out, but it was an example of community building. And that to me has always been what the triple decker meant. Also, it created a music form that probably we've never seen in any other part of the world, because there are people constantly listening to the music, be it on radio or live, that people haven't heard before. Imagine all the different ways in which people must have reacted within a triple decker, as I'm sure many of you have noticed. The fact that it's one way out. And what's very different about that that's happening now to these triple deckers is that the triple deckers now are becoming condominiums. And that means many of them have various entrances and exits. So they don't, and they're not forced to meet their neighbor as they walk down the stairs, a simple thing. But think of all the ways in which you negotiate life when you're walking down a set of stairs. How do you move out of the way? How do you look at what they have, perhaps that someone from an old country gave them and they're carrying in their hands? Levels of politeness, levels of sociability, levels of curiosity were all part of the life of living in a triple decker, which is why to me it's such a fascinating story, because life happens and life is learned and life is changed in small, intricate ways, and ways in which we don't even consider most of the time how much we're learning, because learning happens in the most disguised ways. It can be learning through the smells that you smell on the third floor of a building. It could be learning from the gardening techniques that happen outside. It could be learning from how a person is taking care of someone when they're sick and what they're using for healing. It could be a learning process that someone is looking and watching how someone takes care of their children. It's an ecosystem within a triple decker. Down at the basements of triple decker, many that I've seen have a place to create wine. All kinds of smells and food are generated at dinner time in those places. Elders are taken care of and their stories are told. It's a way in which America was constantly in the process of change and being created. And that's why, to me, the stories of each and every triple decker needs to be told, every one, because it is the story of America's, of the building of this America that we're living in. A multicultural America, America of community, America of adaptability, America of recognizing that you can't do it by yourself. They're like little communes of some sort or another in its best form. You know, that said, there's not, you know, there's always an issue where I'm sure people get into fights, people have trouble, but they work it out. And those are stories that need to be told and need to be learned. Of course, like I said, there was aspects of racism, of course, in there. There's fights that occur, there's difficulties that occur. I'm just looking at some of the other things that I wanted to talk about. The other thing is—
Marc, you have about 2 minutes.
2 minutes. The other thing also to be cognizant about is when the triple decker goes, when it's torn down, we don't replace it with another triple decker, although there are efforts in that way. What we end up getting is, like we get up in Lawrence, Maine, Lawrence, Massachusetts, where what we had was huge swaths of triple deckers being torn down, and in its place was highways and suburban housing, which does nothing to the texture of life, to the teaching of us, and to the ways in which we have come as far as we have in terms of being receptive to differences. That's it.
Thank you, Marc. I know I'm not a native New Englander, so I find the story of ThreeDeckers so fascinating, and there's such a rich history. And I did see in the chat that a couple of people had noted that there are some that are listed on the National Register, some here in Rhode Island. Good. And I believe there are a number of them in districts kind of throughout the region, but
that's great.
Yeah,
that's
I think we're just starting to kind of, you know, give their story the full, you know, that it deserves. So thank you so much.
Well, it's a pleasure. I love talking about it, and thank you for your work. I appreciate it. Yeah.
Great.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to go ahead and share the PowerPoint for our next speaker. And then after Ned, we'll have some time for some more discussion, and I think we'll have some great conversations. All right. Ned, we're going to turn it over to you.
Can you hear me? I just got a memo on my screen, so you can hear me now.
Yes, I can hear you now.
Good. This is going to be a romp. We've got to move rather quickly through about 14 slides. This is a National Register story, which is it's kind of interesting because The National Register has been invoked a number of times in the two preceding presentations. And this is a story about a place in Pawtucket, Rhode Island, a housing project built in 1940, finished in 1942, built by the Pawtucket Housing Authority. And it came up for National Register consideration back in 2014. And a number of things drive the National Register process. It could be just a municipality wants to list something. It could be a local preservation group. It could be an individual owner. But a big driver in the last 20 years or so in Rhode Island has been the historical preservation tax credit, that if your property is listed on the National Register, you may well be eligible for a 20% tax credit toward a whole range of what are called QREs, qualified rehabilitation expenses. And this was a brand new building type for the State Preservation Commission to consider. At the time, there were a number of housing projects that were listed nationally, but none in Rhode Island. And at the moment, there are about 25 New Deal era through World War II housing projects that are now listed on the National Register of Historic Places. And this really represents to me the idea that the National Register has become far more inclusive as the decades have gone by since it was established in the 1960s. From George Washington slept here, we've gone to somebody slept here. John Smith slept here. We've become far more inclusive. And it is an entirely reasonable thing to look at a housing project and consider its story and how it fits into the criteria of the National Register of Historic Places. One thing I'd like to point out is the word project is a wonderful etymological study of how a meaning of a word can morph. When Franklin Roosevelt came into office in March of '33, it was a country in crisis. Unemployment, housing, manufacturing, farming, everything. The nation was on the ropes. And he brought into his administration some housing visionaries. They were called housers. Catherine Bauer was an important one among them. And they envisioned a housing project in the sense of a housing endeavor, an almost utopian idea that housing can uplift people and government can have a programmatic and very healthy role in uplifting people who are down on their luck. And over the decades, that generated into the projects. And I think I kind of confronted that in some ways when I got a call in 2014 to think about Prospect Heights. I'd grown up a mile and a half away from Prospect Heights, which was in, about a mile or so southeast of the downtown center of Pawtucket. And it was a very, very troubled place, teetered on demolition in the 1970s. It dodged so many bullets, well, literally and figuratively. And it survived. Next slide, please, Leigh. There we go. There are two important, there's a lot of stuff that goes on in a National Register nomination form, but two of the important things are a statement of significance. What does this place mean? And a description. And an important aspect of the description is, does the place have integrity? In other words, how much there is there? How much is there of when the place was originally built? To what extent does it look like it was its original design? On the left, you see a newspaper image of Prospect Heights as a whole set of almost barracks-like, very minimally modernistic flat roof buildings with a little bit of trim around the doorways, industrial style windows, And over the years, there were a number of changes, and this is a big integrity question. The flat roofs were changed to hip-on gable, which makes more sense in New England because snow can run off. We had a whole unit collapse because of water penetration in the 1980s. Energy efficient windows had been installed, replacement doors, bracketed hoods, parking was brought up close to the building. But the important thing is that the general configuration of buildings from 1940 remained. There had been no demolition. The windows and doors might have changed, but the openings were the same. And so the place in a lot of ways still spoke to the original design of 1940. Next slide, please. Another aspect, as I said, of National Register process is significance. In other words, what does this place mean? What is its story? And we hung our hat, in this case, on criterion A, that the property is associated with events that have made a significant contribution to the broad patterns of our history. And in a minute, I will get into what particular contribution Prospect Heights made. And I'll fill you in right now that we did, in fact, get National Register listing in December of 2015, but it was a bumpy road. It was a new type of building or site type that the Rhode Island Preservation Commission, the National Register Review Board, were really not familiar with. But as I mentioned earlier, there are now about 25 NR-listed housing projects from the New Deal to the post-World War II period in the United States. Next slide, please. In our case, specifically for Prospect Heights, and I don't like to read off PowerPoint, but I will in this case, because this is the exact wording. It was significant as the physical expression of New Deal federal efforts to address a critical shortage of adequate and affordable housing and assist and guide local communities in the construction of public housing projects. This is a very important thing for us to be thinking about in 2021, because there is still very, very vivid debate in the United States right now about what the role of government is. There's a significant body of people who seem to oppose the whole idea of governance. So a place like Prospect Heights and its ability to uplift people and give people a leg up is a hugely important story. It was then, I think it still is. Next slide. This criterion A story has an awful lot to do with this man, this idea of a New Deal. In 1937, I see 1/3 of a nation ill-housed, ill-clad, ill-nourished. Pawtucket, talk about Rhode Island being on the ropes. Pawtucket was a mess in the Great Depression. The 20s didn't roar in Pawtucket. The textile industries were already leaving in the 1920s. And by the time the Depression hit in 29, Pawtucket was on the ropes. One textile mill after another was shuttering. And the housing stock in Pawtucket was in very, very bad shape. The private market was, in some ways like it is now, tending to just produce upper scale housing. And the working poor were forced into post-Civil War tenements, many of which had no central heating, a potbelly stove, no indoor plumbing, so that means there was an outhouse in the backyard, no electricity. These places were extraordinarily difficult to live in, especially in a New England winter. Next slide. So by 1937, the federal government was beginning to distribute and propagate recommended plans from the Housing Division of the Public Works Administration on how to build housing projects. The Federal Housing Act of 1937 was a very important piece of legislation because prior to that, from 33 to 37, the federal government did everything. They found the land, hired the architect, built it, and even the landlord when all was said and done. And by 1937, under the provisions of this new law, the Federal Housing Act, the federal government got out of the business of being a landlord and a rent collector and a trash collector and all of that. And they gave state municipalities the authority to establish local housing authorities that would get a 60-year loan from the federal government and would build housing projects according to a certain set of unit plans. And central to these plans was the idea of reversing the quality of life in these old Civil War era tenements and backlot houses, and have adequate movement of air, ventilation, and sunlight. Next slide, please. I just wanted to give you a few examples of projects that were built before 1937 by the federal government. University Homes in Atlanta, Greenbelt, which is listed on the National Register, Greendale, Wisconsin, Jane Addams houses in Chicago, Illinois. These are remarkable places. In Greenbelt, for example, the unit cost was $16,000 per unit. Belt tightening as the 30s wore on really brought the per unit price down. And by the time Prospect Heights was built, the per apartment unit cost was around $3,000. So say goodbye to the public sculpture, the wonderful Art Deco, stairwells and things like that. Or in Greendale, you see these hipped roofs. They really strip things down, which you can see in the design of Prospect Heights. Next slide, please. Off to the right, we have some plans. We were very lucky to find a full set of plans from John F. O'Malley, the local architect who was hired by the Pawtucket Housing Authority to design Prospect Heights. Incredibly detailed set of plans. And as I mentioned earlier, the city of Pawtucket was able to form its housing authority in 1939. And very soon applied for a 60-year loan and shopped around for a good location for a housing project. Next slide. They found a 21-acre property down in the southeast corner of the city, not too far from the East Providence line. And as I mentioned, a mile and a half from downtown Pawtucket. And one of the reasons they were able to do that was an earlier requirement of the Housing Act of 1937 was called proportionality, which means if you're going to build 300 units over in this end of Pawtucket, you have to demolish and remove 300 units of substandard housing. And because they said, well, otherwise the problem's just going to keep going on. Well, that turned out to be a heck of a lot more difficult to do than it might have appeared on paper. The legal implications were absolutely onerous. Sometimes a single property was owned by several different people. So they just said to heck with proportionality. And they found a big, mostly undeveloped space over along Beveridge Hill Avenue and Prospect Street in Pawtucket and purchased this 21 acres of former industrial land. Next slide. This hung in the laundry room of Prospect Heights for decades and decades and was never vandalized, never broken. I can't quite believe it, but this is the 1939 architect's rendering of Prospect Heights. And one of the things I wanted to point out was the radiating pattern of buildings designed specifically for ventilation and penetration of light. This was done by the renderer who was working with John O'Malley at the time. And I think it's a remarkable survival. Next slide, please. Ground was broken in September 1st, 1940 on this $1.5 million project. Here you see we were lucky to find a whole bunch of construction photos, and you see the regularity of these buildings, the almost military barracks kind of look of this sequence of two-story brick buildings. The reason I put the illustration from the Wizard of Oz down the bottom is that movie came out in '39, and the moment when they wake up and they see the Emerald City ahead of them, it's hard for us to imagine, especially with our notions of the idea of project, what this place meant to people in 1940, 1939. It must have appeared like some clean, well-lit place had descended from Mars. It was very much like the Emerald City, I think. Next slide, please. And the real clincher was the kitchens. So Prospect Heights had 35 fireproof buildings, 310 apartment units. It's now less than that because they've combined some. But the amenities included central heating, indoor plumbing, electrical refrigerators, a gas stove, concrete floors with linoleum covering. I think people were flabbergasted by the modernity and the hygienic surfaces and the ease of cleaning that these apartments represented. These are things that we might take for granted now, but they were not taken for granted in 1940. Next slide, please. The rent was on a floating scale. So a 3.5 unit was $18 to $23 a month based upon your income. And that income would have been $1,200 to $1,300. For the largest units, which was 6.5 room, your rent would be $19.50 to $27 based upon an income that would have ranged from $900 to $1,500. And we found a wonderful photograph of a family, I think looking at one of the model units, just plopped down in the chairs saying, "This is home." Next slide, please. The total cost of this project was $45 million, and National Register listing made it eligible for the Historical Preservation Tax Credit. And as I mentioned, the QREs, the Qualified Rehabilitation Expenses, the ones to which the tax credit applies, was 31 million of this 45. And so you do the math, the 20% historical preservation tax credit was $6 million. This project also received funds from Rebuild Rhode Island. I'm not sure how many pieces of the puzzle there were, but the project now, as run by Wind Development, is a remarkable example of the success of the historical preservation tax credit and the National Register process and a number of other funding sources. And it gives us a sense in 2021 of that almost utopian project that the housers of the early New Deal had in mind, and that we can still get a glimpse of in 2021. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Ned. It's a great project and wonderful to see an example of the National Register being kind of applied to a public housing. Is just, I wonder if, those who created the National Register even thought that it was something that would be listed at some point in its history.
I doubt that.
Yeah, I bet. They were thinking about those George Washington slept here buildings, not anybody slept here. So I just want to take a minute here to remind our attendees that if you have any questions, you're welcome to please put them in the Q&A, and we will be talking with our panelists here. So we'll kick off. So, when we look at these building types, they're very visually different from each other. But as you each were speaking, I think we start to see kind of some similarities in the stories of these housing types. And so it's very interesting kind of coming at the end of the symposium where we've been talking about conversations about keeping and creating affordable housing. And here we have, you know, 3 historical examples of this type of housing. And I wonder, you know, kind of Ned, you alluded to kind of with the projects or the, the public housing and that kind of perception that people have of it now. You know, Rachel, you're showing kind of some modest, very functional buildings that are, you know, function over beauty. And I think, Marc, with the ThreeDeckers, you know, we've got these kind of diversity of people who were living there. And I wonder, you know, I'm going to kind of kick off our questions here with, how do you think this kind of perception has impacted the preservation of these housing types? And what perceptions have changed or need to change to recognize the importance of these building types and kind of the evolution of American vernacular architecture?
Well,
Are
as
you
I
directing-
started off, you know, I think there is this perception that we just need to save the biggest and prettiest, and that's simply not true. And in fact, those are usually the buildings that have always received the most investment to be built in the first place and are usually continually occupied. But, you know, good things come in small packages, and this is the housing types, modest though they may be, are desirable. And also, you know, the pendulum of how we live changes. And so, you know, we've moved away from big houses in the suburbs. Some folks have, and as boomers age, might want a smaller 1-story house living situation. And so things change, and these buildings can adapt and be there as we still need, you know, there's never a surplus of housing. So we need to occupy what we've got and build more in a smart way.
Thank you, Rachel.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I grew up in a 6th-floor brick apartment building in Queens, New York. And as many who lived in those kind of stories tells the story, it was a place where kids played in the street, where people walked each other's kids across the boulevard to get some candy, where kids learned how to socialize. I think the suburbs have not done a good job in teaching how people live in a community. And I would hope that any of the investments that are occurring now, especially by the government, are done in such a way to reinforce the fact that we're all in it together.
One thought that comes to mind for me is, you know, in the context of our current political discourse about critical race theory and Black Lives Matter, a point has been made that history is not a bedtime story. You know, history is quite real. The conflicts are quite real. And it's important for us to know the truth. And housing projects are not a bedtime story most of the time. That's one of the things that's most remarkable about what happened at Prospect Heights, because if it has a story to tell about how people lived, how people maybe managed to get a leg up and catch their breath at the tail end of the Depression and eventually move out to the suburbs, or the programmatic role of government in uplifting people. These places have remarkable stories to tell, but I would argue that if you dig around in just about any National Register project or any historical project, you find compelling stories that, in many cases, if there's enough there, can elevate it to the National Register of Historic Places.
I totally agree. And Leigh, if I may, I wanted to interject. You know, Ned talked about his project having a utopian vision from the beginning. I think the Mill Villages, it's really the opposite. In retrospect, we've applied this utopian, you know, picturesque New England villages We can all conjure the image of a vintage Christmas card. But if these were mill villages, they were noisy and dirty and industrial places. That doesn't mean that there weren't, elements of a village there, but this was not utopian. They were constructed, these were paternalistic places, and it was all about control and surveillance, because it was about production and profit. So I think we need to catch ourselves when there are beautiful New England villages all around, but let's think about the people who built them and worked in them, and how their lives, it wasn't just a serene body of water. There was constant noise and pollution.
I think it's worth considering where the utopian is, and what are the elements of a utopian world that we need to take in the most practical way, in a way that doesn't degrade anybody or lessen the significance of anybody, but recognize when the government is in the process of working with the citizens in a way that's positive rather than pecuniary or not so much that. It's teaching lessons constantly. Everything we do, every place we go, are teaching expectations about how we're going to live our life. If you're a child, you are constantly in sort of negotiation with yourself and others about how you're going to live, how you're going to treat everybody, how you're going to take care of yourself, and what choices that you make as you get older. I just think we're in a sort of a rather dystopian moment at this point, and it's very, very difficult to conjure up what it's like when a government understands that we're all better when one person's better, and one person's better when all are better. And I just think, and I hope that's the message. I'll tell quickly, I was reading a book for a moment or two on Bess Meyerson, of all people. I was thinking of doing a video on her for some reason. I was searching around for something I wanted to do. And she grew up in this place, and there was exclusivity to it because it was mostly Jewish, first generation, but they had art in that apartment building. They had lessons in theater. They had all kinds of ways in which everybody interacted with everybody else, probably with fights, no doubt. But nonetheless, you had a sense that the world was filled with richness rather than with psychological and psychological and other forms of destitution. So again, these moments of utopianism are great to be able to be released on the public, to show that all was not always a question of billionaires and hyper millionaires, but was somehow much more egalitarian.
I think these are all great points. And I know, the work going on at Historic New England right now, so long we've been telling stories of kind of the families in these houses, and now we're kind of telling the other side of the stories. And I think it's a great contrast, Rachel, that you brought up, that these mill houses are, it was noisy. It wasn't, a utopian like maybe the public housing that Ned was working on. And I think we're starting to kind of recognize that it's okay to say that, there was good in this, but there was also the stories of the people who lived there and those challenges that came with them. So are there other challenges that these housing types are kind of facing that threatens their preservation? I know, we've kind of talked about this perceptive, are they worthy of significance? We're kind of up against that challenge, but are there other pressures on these housing types? I think, Marc, you had mentioned some of the ThreeDeckers being demolished, but is there, are you familiar with kind of the reasons why some of this is happening with these building types in particular that we've talked about today?
I think the biggest threat is that they are just so ubiquitous. I know we've lost so many mills. I've looked at those before, and yet there's still a lot of them. Many have been adaptively reused, and some have not been yet. But when it comes to, our TripleDeckers, our cottages, you just think, oh, it doesn't matter if I demolish this one, because there are just hundreds and thousands of them. But having an appreciation for the type and realizing that each one is special and represents generations of families that have lived in them. I would hope we can make an argument for them to be respected, given more respect.
Well, they're given, sorry, Ned, go ahead. Sorry.
No, I wasn't going to say anything.
They're not given respect because a suburban mentality, unfortunately, or a condominium mentality has taken over our sense of dreams with housing. We don't really value the fact that we could live with various people in an environment where one could learn from other people, where you have to negotiate situations, where you have to be someone who is in constant social negotiation with the environment around them. I think we have created aspirations for ourselves that rule out all but the finest $500 million houses, and without having a vision of what it means to live amongst people, different people in different situations, providing parkland and places for kids to play and good schools to go to. It's about success doesn't have to do as much with the community that you're surrounded by as much as it does with how you fortified yourself from community.
One of the things Rachel pointed out was about these mill villages were as picturesque as we may think them to be now. Yes, there was a heavy hand of paternalism, and it all had to do with making sure, in many cases, that people didn't get drunk and cause problems on the looms the following morning. They were definitely watching you. In the case of housing projects, history just isn't always pretty, and there's wonderfully instructive things that we can learn. For example, poverty breeds all kinds of social problems, social dysfunction. And there was a movement to build 10-story, 12-story high-rise housing projects like the Hartford projects in Oneyville. And it was an unmitigated disaster. These places were dangerous. The elevators often didn't work. People were afraid to even go into the stairwells. The drug dealing and all kinds of stuff. And I remember almost, every few months you'd see some video clip on the news of a housing project being, a controlled demolition of a high-rise housing project. The fascinating thing about Prospect Heights was its human scale. Despite the orderly arrangement of the buildings and all of that, it was that none of them was higher than 2 stories, and it had a human scale to it. And somehow or another, we had an instinct with the planning of Prospect Heights and a lot of the other projects built under the aegis of the 1937 law, that it's very important for humans to exist in a place where there's some scale that we can appreciate in relation to the size of our own bodies. There's an awful lot to be learned from what failed in housing projects and what succeeded.
Ned, I'm going to push back for a second in this for a little bit on you there, because having grown up in New York and having friends that lived in some of those apartments, it's not so much, and I agree that there is something problematic with the heights, but it's about what extras they put in or not. Like my friend grew up in a 12, 15-story place, but they had a doorman. They had someone who was in charge of cleaning up. There was parks next to the building. There were others that were less concerned with those kind of, quote, amenities.
Yeah.
And when you leave out those amenities, you leave a sense of that they don't mean anything to anybody. People read the landscape all the time and decide how they interact with it. And when you create something that is without aesthetics, without care, without an intelligent relationship to who's living there, you create the invitation to destroy on some fashion or another. If not fully destroy, then to compromise. So if you're going to do something, you do it in a way that respects people and makes them feel respected. And it's not so much, again, the height, it's about the environment that you are making for people. Do people feel cared for? Do people feel part of this world? Do people have the opportunity to get out of the, if you go up to different parts of New York, you see these vacant places that resemble some sort of desert, a human desert. There's people, you don't see people, people are scared to walk around. It's because of how they produced it and how they spent their money and how they really cared or not.
And how they maintained it over time.
And then how they maintained it.
Yeah.
No question. No question. Yeah. Yeah.
I think we've had some really great discussion here, and I think you're all kind of touching on some of these intangible kind of stories and the way we interact with each other that is kind of comes with these types of housing and this kind of sense of community that comes with them. I think we have time for one more question. So I'm going to propose to our panelists, listing in the National Register of Historic Places has strong associations in preservation. It often kind of guides the creation of local historic districts and the implementation of other protective measures. How might National Register criteria or other local policies or what might be considered kind of our traditional preservation toolbox need to change to kind of open doors to preserving these common housing types from the last century?
I have a thought on that. I don't know.
Yeah, please. I know you've kind of got, I think, the most direct experience of all of us working with the National Register in these housing types.
The integrity that I talked about in my presentation can be a real problem because unlike, a high style house, from the federal era or something like that, workforce housing is constantly being changed. Vinyl comes along, so we don't have to paint. Let's slather it with vinyl. Let's yank the windows out. Let's put plastic windows in. Let's do whatever we can to just keep the place around and keep extracting rent from it or whatever. And so as a result, a lot of these places have present very serious problems with regard to what the National Register looks for in terms of integrity. And I would argue that we need to really rethink that or have some kind of new designation or something, because so many of these places, like we discussed this about South Providence a number of years ago at the annual preservation conference, that places that may have a lot of meaning to, like the first bodega along Elmwood or Broad in South Providence, it might not even be there anymore, but somehow or another, there's something there of the spirit of what went on there and what it meant to the emergent Latin community. So I don't have an answer for this, but I think somehow or another we have to have some sort of floating understanding of integrity in order to save these places that have been subject to all kinds of changes, not the least of which is vinyl.
Yeah, I think integrity is important when you're talking about an architectural style, but when you're talking about, like Prospect Heights and Criterion A and that kind of social context that it developed in, you start to wonder kind of how much does craftsmanship or those sorts of things really bring the significance to this building. So I think it's interesting that you brought that up, and wonderful that you brought that kind of example in your presentation. Rachel or Mark, did you want to have any thoughts on those?
Well, again, I grew up in a neighborhood, and what was valuable about that was that, and it's interesting what you say, Ned, about, it could not be there, but it's there in everybody's mind still. Physically, it's not there, but there are many places where you just have a sense of what went on there. And as soon as you go back to those neighborhoods, you imagine back in your mirror of life, what kind of world that you were living in as a 6-year-old, as a 10-year-old. And those places have strong validity. If there's a way of neighborhoods telling their stories at various times and not worrying so much about, has to be pure this or this has to be pure that, and instead have a set of values about what you're creating, how you're creating it, and what you're doing to maintain it. That's the most important thing. Why are you creating housing? You're creating housing so people can have a comfortable life, take care of each other, and be a person who can contribute to the world, because you don't have to worry about where you're living. Reminding people about what it is to have small stores rather than giant suburban horrible
Boxes.
Where you just want to get in and out as quick as you can, and you do it fast, and you do it as impersonally as you can. We just have to reclaim what it is to live well. And that doesn't mean huge amounts of expenditures of money, but it has to mean community and what fosters it and what doesn't.
Thank you. So I just want to say thank you to our speakers, and I'm going to hand it back over to Kelsey as we've kind of approached the end of our session today.
Well, thank you again to our speakers and to everyone who's joined us today and in the last 2 weeks to have some of this difficult conversation, to try and find new ways of both creating new housing and preserving what we have. I think today has been a really wonderful reminder that we do still have these intact examples of workforce housing in our environment here in Rhode Island especially, and that they're still serving their original purpose, which is to bring people together, to house people in walkable communities near to where they work and go to school and worship. And that's what we need to see more and more of, so that other people have that opportunity to join us in that fellowship. So thank you. A reminder, you can catch up on all of the symposium programming on our YouTube channel next month. And it's been a pleasure sharing this space with you over the last 10 days. Thank you and take care.